In 1944, more than 2 years after Pearl Harbor, the U.S. military had pushed Japan out of many islands. But the farther they advanced, the greater the distance between bases became, and the sky turned into the most dangerous frontier. At Hollandia Air Base in northern New Guinea, the roar of Lockheed P-38 Lightnings echoed day and night. This twin-boom, twin-engine fighter, hailed as a symbol of American industrial might, could fly faster than 650 kilometers per hour, climb to 12,000 meters, and escort bombers on the longest missions. Yet all that power depended on one seemingly trivial thing: fuel. According to the technical manual, the P-38 had a combat radius of only about 570 miles, meaning it could fly out roughly 280 miles, fight, and return. But the Pacific theater was unlike any other. From Hollandia to the Philippines or Borneo was over 600 miles of open ocean. Pilots had to fly 6, 7, even 8 continuous hours, with no place to land in the vast sky and sea. If they ran out of fuel, they had only one choice: bail out into the ocean and hope to be rescued. Many never returned. They didn't die from bullets, but because their fuel gauges hit the red zone. On July 1, 1944, 4 P-38s from the 475th Fighter Group completed a 6.5-hour patrol and returned to base. 3 landed with nearly empty tanks, the pilots exhausted and soaked in sweat. But the 4th stunned everyone. When mechanics measured its fuel, they found over 200 gallons remaining, 4 times more than the others. People thought the gauge was broken, but repeated checks confirmed the reading. Who was the pilot? Not an Air Force officer, but a civilian. Charles Augustus Lindbergh, the aviation legend who had crossed the Atlantic solo in 1927. 17 years earlier, Lindbergh had become a national icon by flying the Spirit of St. Louis from New York to Paris, launching the era of intercontinental flight. Now, at 42, he appeared on the Pacific Front, not for a show, but as a civilian technical advisor for Lockheed, invited by the Navy and Air Force to train pilots in long-range flying. He was remembered as the lone hero of peacetime, but few knew he would soon revolutionize the U.S. Air Force's combat thinking. In his early days at Hollandia, Lindbergh quietly observed. He watched pilots start up, take off, adjust throttle, fuel mix, and RPM. He took detailed notes, never criticizing anyone. But a question grew in his mind. Why were these P-38s burning so much fuel? Having flown tens of thousands of kilometers in extreme conditions, Lindbergh knew that aircraft engines didn't need high RPMs to generate power. What mattered was combustion efficiency in the cylinders. Yet here, every pilot strictly followed the standard procedure. 2,200 RPM, rich mixture, 28 inches of manifold pressure. They were taught that lowering RPM and increasing pressure, called over-square operation, would cause engine failure. That night, in the tin-roofed command hut, Lindbergh met Colonel Charles McDonald, the young commander of the 475th, with over 30 aerial victories. Amid the creak of a desk fan and the lingering smell of fuel, Lindbergh spoke slowly. "You could fly farther if you let the engines work the right way." McDonald frowned. "What do you mean?" Lindbergh picked up a pen and wrote on a scrap of paper. 1,600 RPM, 30 inches pressure, auto lean mixture. He said, "Lower RPM, higher pressure, leaner mix. The result? At least 30% fuel savings without damaging the engine." The room fell silent. One officer objected. "That's suicide. The engines will burn out." Lindbergh calmly replied, "I flew across the Atlantic using this exact method. If I were wrong, I'd have died 17 years ago." McDonald looked into his eyes. It wasn't the gaze of a reckless man, but of someone who understood machines to their very core. At last, he said, "All right, tomorrow morning you'll fly with us." And so, in the midst of a fiery war zone, a civilian prepared to risk his life to prove a principle of science and engineering. That night, a Pacific breeze rustled the palm trees, blowing across the shimmering silver wings under the moonlight. In the command tent, Lindbergh adjusted the controls of the P-38 he would fly the next morning. Twin Allison V1710 engines, each producing 1,600 horsepower. He set the RPM to 1,600, pressure to 30 inches, auto lean mix, settings never before authorized by the Air Force. One small mistake could shut down both engines over the ocean. But he believed in theory, in experience, and above all, in the idea that in war, nothing is more valuable than correct knowledge. The next morning, as the sun rose over Hollandia, 4 Lightnings took off. 3 flew the old way. 1, Charles Lindbergh's, flew a completely different way. And no one at that tiny base knew that just hours later, the history of U.S. military aviation would turn a new page. Early morning, July 3rd, 1944. At Hollandia Air Base, the Lockheed P-38 Lightnings were preparing for takeoff. Among the young pilots stood Charles Lindbergh, the only civilian on the battlefield. He wore no uniform, carried no rank, just a small notebook filled with notes on engines. Today, he would fly alongside combat pilots to prove that his unconventional engine settings could save their lives. The mission was a long-range patrol to the Samate Island area, a journey of over 1,200 miles, nearly twice the P-38's safe radius. Lindbergh's aircraft, once flown by ace pilot Richard Bong, was powered by 2 Allison V1710 engines. By regulation, pilots had to fly at 2,200 RPM, 28 inches of manifold pressure, with a rich fuel mixture. But Lindbergh would do the opposite. Drop RPM to 1,600, raise pressure to 30 inches, and use auto-lean mixture. One small error could blow the engines mid-ocean. At 5:30 a.m., 4 P-38s took off, led by Colonel Charles McDonald, with Lindbergh on the right wing, followed by Thomas McGuire and Bobby Johnson. They flew at 10,000 feet, 185 miles per hour. McDonald held the standard configuration, while Lindbergh adjusted his settings according to his formula. 2 hours passed. The formation held steady. Lindbergh's engine hummed with an unusually smooth rhythm. His fuel gauge barely moved, while McDonald's had dropped significantly. Reaching the Samate area, they spotted 3 Japanese transport ships. McDonald ordered an attack. The team dove, firing cannons and machine guns. Lindbergh maintained steady speed and precise control, increasing boost only slightly, never pushing the RPMs. After over 10 minutes of strafing, they pulled back and climbed back to cruising altitude. When McDonald checked fuel levels, the results stunned them. 2, 60%, 3, 58%, 4, 72%. Lindbergh still had 72% of his fuel after over 2 hours of flying and a full combat engagement, a number that defied all calculations. Upon returning to Hollandia, the final readings confirmed it. McDonald had 18% remaining. Lindbergh had 34%. His 2 engines ran smoothly, pistons were clean, and temperatures were 10 degrees below average. That afternoon, Lindbergh addressed the squadron. "You were taught that over-square operation destroys engines. But if you understand the principle, it's safe and efficient. Engines don't need to spin fast, they just need to burn in rhythm." The room fell silent. McDonald stepped forward, extended his hand. "Tomorrow, the whole squadron will try your method." Lindbergh simply nodded and said quietly, "The airplane will teach us how to fly farther." That night, mechanic Mike Kowalski wrote in his logbook, "Mission 7/3/1944, engine stable, lowest fuel consumption ever recorded. Maybe today we witnessed a turning point." As the drone of engines echoed in the distance, it became clear. Sometimes victory doesn't come from bullets, but from the courage to challenge what once seemed unchangeable. After the July 3rd, 1944 mission, Hollandia Air Base buzzed like never before. News of Charles Lindbergh's P-38 spread rapidly through the camp. A civilian, flying the same mission as combat pilots, had burned nearly 1/3 less fuel. something far beyond anything the U.S. Air Force had ever known. But for that very reason, many remained skeptical. They said, maybe the gauge was wrong, or he flew slower. Rumors swirled through the field barracks, where fans creaked in the heat. Yet Colonel Charles MacDonald, commander of the 475th Group, had seen it all firsthand. He knew his instruments were accurate, and he knew Lindbergh hadn't flown slower. His plane had stayed in tight formation, maintaining precise altitude and speed the entire time. The truth was undeniable. To be certain, MacDonald ordered mechanic Mike Kowalski to inspect Lindbergh's P-38 engine from top to bottom. The veteran mechanic removed each cylinder head, checked combustion chambers, valves, and pistons. After completing the inspection, he could only shake his head in disbelief. No signs of detonation, no carbon buildup, oil cleaner than usual, combustion temp even 10 degrees lower. These engines look fresh out of the factory. The report was sent up the chain of command. Numbers don't lie. And from that moment, skeptical glances turned into curious ones. A few young pilots volunteered to test the new technique during domestic training flights. Lieutenant Bobby Johnson was the first. When he returned, he told MacDonald, "Sir, I expected an explosion, but there was nothing. The engine ran smoother, and the fuel savings were real, only 70 gallons an hour instead of 100. MacDonald said nothing, just nodded. He knew they were witnessing a major shift. In the days that followed, Lindbergh flew with small squadrons. He didn't lecture or grandstand. He just sat in the cockpit, demonstrating each step. Lower RPM, adjust pressure, lean the mixture, hold steady speed. After landing, he had the pilots record every number: RPM, speed, pressure, temperature, fuel burn. Gradually, the growing pile of data became irrefutable proof. By mid-July, the entire 475th Fighter Group adopted the Lindbergh settings. From 2,200 down to 1,600 RPM, manifold pressure increased to 30 inches, auto-lean mixture. The results were consistent, flight after flight. Average fuel consumption dropped by 30%, range increased by 150 miles. Not a single engine failure, not one damaged piston. Mechanic Kowalski wrote in his maintenance log, "Engines running smoother, temp stable, oil cleaner. Maybe we've been wrong for years." At the same time, Major Thomas McGuire, the hot-headed young ace, began endorsing the technique. A battle-hardened skeptic, he finally said, "I used to think civilians didn't know a damn thing about war. I was wrong. That man just gave us a better chance to survive." His words spread quickly across the base. From doubt came respect. From respect, trust. Lindbergh, as always, remained quiet. He spent more time with mechanics than officers, teaching them how to tune spark plugs, how to read engine vibrations. He didn't act like a hero. He was more like a master craftsman in a workshop. Once, a pilot asked him, "Aren't you afraid? What if the engine fails over the ocean?" Lindbergh just smiled. "I trust numbers more than fear." That calmness spread to others. By the end of July, MacDonald sent an official report to Pacific Air Force Command. Average fuel consumption reduced by 29.8%. Range increased from 570 to 740 miles. No mechanical failures reported. The report was marked confidential, but word spread fast. At Morotai, Biak, Nadzab, P-38 pilots started experimenting with the Lindbergh method. The results repeated exactly. In wartime, nothing spreads faster than a technique that saves lives. One evening, sitting in the command tent, MacDonald asked Lindbergh, "Why did you dare to trust something the entire military considers dangerous?" Lindbergh replied, "Because I've flown long enough to know. Machines don't lie. They only react to how we treat them. If we understand them, they'll be loyal to the end." The words made MacDonald pause. He realized war wasn't just about bullets. It was a battle between knowledge and habit. By month's end, The results were so convincing that the Air Force began sending technical officers to Hollandia to document the new method. They observed, took notes, and flew test missions. A week later, their report confirmed. Lindbergh's fuel-saving technique is effective and safe, recommended for broader adoption. From a civilian, Lindbergh became a symbol of wartime innovation. He persuaded an entire military not with rank, but with results. And strangely, he received no new titles or medals. When asked, he simply said, "I didn't come here to command. I came to learn and share. If what I know helps someone make it home, that's enough." In the days that followed, the skies over Hollandia felt calmer. Pilots flew farther with more confidence. They no longer feared watching their fuel gauges drop too fast. And Lindbergh, every afternoon, would take a quiet walk to the runway, watching the sunset bathe the silver wings of the P-38, and smile softly. He knew a silent revolution had begun, not with shouts or fireworks, but with one man daring to say, "Let's try." On July 28, 1944, the skies over northern New Guinea were crystal clear. At Hollandia Air Base, the 475th Fighter Group buzzed like a hive, preparing for its largest mission yet, an assault on Wewak, the Japanese supply hub in the region. It was a high-risk operation, a nearly 800-mile round trip, pushing the P-38 far beyond its traditional fuel limits. Colonel Charles MacDonald studied the map laid out on the table. He calculated every flight minute, every turning point. Under the old fuel regimen, the squadron could reach the target, but not return. If Charles Lindbergh's engine technique truly worked, today would be the ultimate test, not just for him, but for the entire U.S. Air Force. On the runway, over 30 pilots fired up their twin Allison engines. The roar echoed across the valley. In the lead, Lindbergh sat calmly in the cockpit, meticulously checking his gauges. He stayed true to his settings. 1600 RPM, 30 inches of pressure, auto-lean mixture. Each adjustment was performed slowly and precisely, almost ritualistic. MacDonald's voice boomed over the radio. "Target is Wewak, 300 miles out. Hold formation, fly fuel efficient. Today, we show the world this works." 12 P-38s shot into the sky. Morning light reflected off silver wings like a promise. At 10,000 feet, they switched to cruise mode. Lindbergh flew on the right wing, his voice calm over the radio. "Drop to 1,600 RPM. Hold at 30 inches. Don't worry, these engines can take it." At first, a few pilots hesitated. They feared the soft knock in the cylinders, a sign of pre-ignition. But minute by minute, the engines purred smoothly. The aircraft held speed. Doubt faded, replaced by amazement. After more than 2 hours, Wewak appeared beneath them. A bustling port and airfield crammed with planes, fuel tanks, and trucks. MacDonald gave the command. "Attack now." The squadron broke formation, diving into the target. Flak and fire erupted. Anti-aircraft guns roared like thunder. Black smoke rose everywhere. In the chaos, Lindbergh held his speed, dodging enemy fire with precision no one could believe came from a civilian. He dropped low, lined up a shot, and fired. A Japanese aircraft burst into flames. It was the only combat kill of his life, one he never bragged about, but one his squadmates would never forget. After nearly 15 minutes of combat, the squadron regrouped and climbed back to cruising altitude. Everyone quietly checked their fuel. They'd just flown and fought hard, yet all tanks still had surplus. No one was under 40%. Over the radio, McGuire's voice rang out in disbelief. "I've got over half a tank left. Never seen that before." Lindbergh replied softly, "The sky is still vast. We just hadn't learned how to fly farther yet." Returning to Hollandia, their mission clocks read 8.5 hours. Normally, P-38 pilots would be praying by then. But today, they still had nearly an hour's worth of fuel left. One by one, the silver wings touched down to cheers. The Lindbergh settings had proven themselves under fire. Mechanic Kowalski and the maintenance crew inspected every aircraft. No engine failures, no signs of overheating. The report read, fuel consumption reduced by 31%. Engine performance stable. No piston or spark plug damage. That night, in a tin-roofed hut, pilots gathered around a wooden table. No one talked about the battle. They debated RPM and manifold pressure. In the midst of war, a technical conversation had never felt more profound. They knew they had just witnessed a revolution, not loud, but strong enough to change the way an entire military flew. MacDonald wrote in his report to command, Advisor Lindbergh's method increases combat range to 750 miles, reduces fuel burn by 30%, with no impact on engine durability. Recommends standardization across all units. A few weeks later, the order became official. All P-38 pilots in the Pacific Theater were to adopt the new flight settings. Training centers in the U.S. updated their manuals. From remote bases in Morotai to Biak, from Borneo to the Philippines, the phrase Lindbergh settings spread like a badge of empirical wisdom. That night, Lindbergh sat alone at the forest's edge, watching the last flares of anti-aircraft fire fade on the horizon. He quietly scribbled in his notebook, "It wasn't speed, but understanding that let us fly farther. When man understands his machine, he can outfly even the limits of war." There, amidst frogs and sea breeze, a simple philosophy of man and machine was recorded, not as theory, but in action. And from the Battle of Wewak onward, the U.S. Air Force entered a new era, where technical knowledge became a weapon as vital as any bullet. Top of form. August 1944. The Pacific monsoon winds swept through U.S. Air Force bases, carrying with them surprising news. Across outposts, from Morotai and Biak to the Mariana Islands, P-38 pilots were passing along a simple but astonishingly effective rule of thumb. Lower the RPM, raise the pressure, fly farther. They called it the Lindbergh settings. From a bold experiment at Hollandia, the technique spread like wildfire across fields of ambition. Squadron after squadron began reporting identical results. Nearly one-third less fuel consumption, extended combat range by hundreds of miles, and no engine damage. For combat commanders, these weren't just numbers. They marked a strategic revolution. In the Pacific War, after all, distance was the deadliest enemy. Previously, the P-38 could only escort B-25 or B-24 bombers within a 500-600-mile range. Now, with the new method, they could fly over 750 miles, more under ideal conditions. This meant targets in Borneo, Mindanao, even the Celebes Sea, once out of reach, were now within range. Reports from bases flooded Pacific Command headquarters. Average mission duration increased by 40%. Aborted missions due to fuel shortages dropped to nearly zero. No mechanical failures attributed to over-square engine operation. Technical officers, once skeptical, now had to admit, the old rules are obsolete. Lockheed's Maintenance Bureau confirmed that running the Allison V-1710 at 1,600 RPM with 32 inches of manifold pressure was well within safety limits. The only problem was, no one had dared to try it before. Word quickly spread beyond the battlefield. In California, at Lockheed's Burbank plant, Chief Engineer Clarence Kelly Johnson, the man who designed the P-38, received a telegram from the Pacific Front. Lindbergh settings proving successful. Fuel saving 30%, engines healthy. Johnson smiled. He knew there was only one man capable of making the entire military believe what engineers had long suspected. Only Lindbergh could make the Army trust what we already knew. Back in the U.S., the press couldn't publish the details due to wartime secrecy. But within aviation circles, the story spread quietly. Engineers at Wright Field, home to the Air Force's testing programs, began using Hollandia data to draft new fuel-saving protocols for post-war aircraft. Meanwhile, on the front lines, the real-world impact grew clearer each day. Thomas Maguire, America's second highest-scoring ace and once a Lindbergh skeptic, became the technique's loudest advocate. In his flight log, he wrote, "Lindbergh's technique doesn't just let us fly farther. It makes the plane quieter, smoother. I flew 9 hours straight and didn't feel drained. It was a vital but overlooked change. Pilots felt less fatigue. With smoother engines, less vibration, and stable oxygen use, they could remain alert during 9 to 10-hour flights, once thought impossible. Mechanics, too, breathed easier. Weekly maintenance reports showed a clear drop in piston, spark plug, and valve replacements. One joked, "It's like the engines are getting a break in the middle of the war." At a time when American industry had to produce tens of thousands of engines each month, longer engine life wasn't just technical. It was a national resource-saving strategy. By the end of August 1944, as new bases opened in the Philippines, fresh American pilots were already being trained under the Lindbergh procedure. What was once dismissed as heresy had become official doctrine. Instructors recited the new manual by heart. Cruise 1600 RPM, 30-inch manifold, auto lean mixture. In Colonel McDonald's August journal, a single line stood out. From doubt to belief. It took just one man proving it with action. He would revisit that sentence years later, long after the war ended. Lindbergh remained at the front until the end of August, flying with squadrons in Biak and Noam 4. There, he taught not just how to fly, but how to think. He told young pilots, "Don't fear trying something new if it's grounded in understanding. Every human advancement begins with the right kind of doubt." When he left New Guinea, he took no medals with him. Just a thank you letter from the command and a photo with the squadron. But the numbers stayed behind. Over 1,500 successful missions flown using his technique. Hundreds of lives saved, and millions of gallons of fuel preserved. Numbers that spoke for themselves. From that point on, the U.S. Air Force officially included fuel-efficient flying in every post-war training manual. That foundation allowed the first generation of jet pilots, flying P-80s and later F-86, to carry on Lindbergh's philosophy. Know the machine to fly not just stronger, but smarter. At home, as the war neared its end, the public began to hear whispers of Charles Lindbergh's silent role in the Pacific. The New York Times wrote in 1945, "He wasn't just the man who flew to Paris. He's the man who taught the U.S. Air Force how to fly twice as far." In wartime, America produced millions of tons of steel and hundreds of thousands of aircraft. But its greatest legacy came from something invisible, a mindset willing to defy convention. And Lindbergh's story was the living proof of that spirit, the spirit of industry, science, and belief in human potential. At age 42, Lindbergh had done something generations of pilots would owe him for. Without seeking rank or medals, he left behind a quiet legacy, the belief that knowledge could overcome dogma and that one person could change how a giant machine, the U.S. military, operated. 1944. On the Hollandia runway, P-38 Lightnings continued to take off, carrying men who once doubted, now turned into disciples of knowledge. Charles Lindbergh stood at the edge of the tarmac, one hand resting on his worn headset, silently watching. He knew his time here was drawing to a close. His mission wasn't to fight, but to prove that in war, knowledge is the most powerful weapon. On his final day, Colonel Charles McDonald and the pilots of the 475th Fighter Group lined up to salute him. There was no ceremony, no trumpet calls, just calloused hands clasped tightly in gratitude. "You didn't just help us fly farther," McDonald said. "You taught us to believe in science." Lindbergh only nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon, where long-range missions still filled the sky. From New Guinea, Lindbergh returned to America aboard a transport ship, carrying with him a notebook filled with data. Every setting, every result, every flight. Those pages later became official training material for the U.S. Air Force and Navy. Engineers at Allison studied his records and confirmed. Under Lindbergh's over-square settings, both manifold pressure and RPM stayed well within the engine's safe range. It wasn't engineering, but fear that had kept people from trying the right thing for so many years. The war raged on. By the end of 1944, the Lindbergh settings allowed P-38 squadrons to escort bombers deep into the Philippines, striking Japanese bases once considered untouchable. Fuel savings enabled longer patrols, better protection for amphibious landings. The cold statistics told the story. Mission success rates up 40%, aircraft lost to fuel exhaustion near zero. With extended range, the P-38 Lightning, once deemed too heavy for the Pacific, became the long arm of U.S. air power. Pilots who once feared the fuel gauge now flew confidently for over 8 hours. They hadn't just changed how they flew, they changed how they thought. Victory didn't come from recklessness, but from knowing the limits of both machine and man. Back home, at Lockheed's factories, workers began seeing their jobs differently. Lindbergh's story became a wartime symbol of American industrial spirit, where knowledge belonged not to a few, but to anyone brave enough to seek the truth. Understand it to do it better. That motto hung on the Burbank factory wall through 1945. After the war, Charles Lindbergh returned to a quiet life. He asked for no titles, sought no fame. In his 1953 memoir, The Spirit of St. Louis, he wrote only a single line about those years. In the Pacific, I learned that war can be won not just with guns, but by understanding engines and ourselves more deeply. But his comrades never forgot. Colonel MacDonald, later one of the Air Force's top aces, once said, "Every time I flew farther than the manual allowed and made it home, I thought of Lindbergh. He didn't just teach us to save fuel, he taught us to think differently." In the post-war era, the U.S. Air Force kept the Lindbergh spirit alive in every new aircraft generation. When the F-86 jet was developed, engineer Kelly Johnson, who had designed the P-38, reminded his team, "Remember Lindbergh's rule, the most powerful engine is the one we understand best." That philosophy became the bedrock of America's jet program in the 1950s. Lindbergh went on to serve as a technical advisor for civil aviation. Drawing from his wartime experience, he helped develop fuel-efficient cruise protocols, laying the foundation for what we now call cruise economy flight, used by every commercial pilot today. His legacy didn't just stay in military skies. It now travels with millions of civilian passengers every day. Above all, his story proved this: one person, armed with understanding and courage, can change the mindset of an entire institution. In a world governed by orders and procedures, Lindbergh had dared to ask, why? And because of that, an entire military learned how to fly twice as far. Years later, at the Smithsonian, the P-38 Lightning Lindbergh once flew was restored. On its fuselage, a small inscription was engraved: "To Charles A. Lindbergh, who taught us how to fly farther." A former 475th pilot once stood before that aircraft, silent for a long while, then said, "He didn't just teach us to fly farther in the air, he taught us to fly farther in the mind." The skies over the Pacific are peaceful now. But in the history of aviation, the story of 1944 still shines like a star. It reminds us that sometimes truth isn't found in manuals or commands, but in the courage of those willing to try. And that's the spirit that built wartime America, a nation powered by justice, science, and the belief in the mind's strength. As night falls over the aging wrecks at Hollandia, you can still imagine the distant hum of twin Allison engines, low, smooth, steady, like the heartbeat of a generation that believed knowledge was freedom, wisdom was power, and courage was the wings that let humanity fly farther than ever before.